The nightmares that haunted James Mitchell for years shattered like glass the moment he locked eyes with the wild, terrified horse nobody wanted. In that single, electric instant of recognition, the broken Marine and the abandoned Mustang saw themselves in each other, two wounded souls standing at the edge of their last chance. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The morning light filtered through the gaps in the weathered barn, casting long golden rays across the dusty floor. James Mitchell stood in the doorway, his weathered face a map of the battles he'd fought, both overseas and within himself. At 62, the retired Marine carried the weight of his experiences like a physical burden, his shoulders permanently hunched as if still bearing the weight of his pack through desert terrain. His eyes, once sharp and alert, now carried a distant look, as if perpetually gazing at horizons others couldn't see. 3 years had passed since James returned from his final tour. 3 years of silence in this remote farmhouse he'd inherited from his uncle. 3 years of nightmares that tore him from sleep, of memories that ambushed him in quiet moments, of a darkness that had settled into his bones. The doctors had names for it: PTSD, major depressive disorder, adjustment difficulties. James had simpler words. He was broken, used up, a relic of battles fought and comrades lost. His daughter Emily called twice a week, her voice tight with worry, as she asked how he was doing, if he was eating, if he'd spoken to anyone. His answers were always the same, brief assurances that kept her from driving up from the city to check on him. The truth was, James hadn't spoken to another soul in weeks, besides the occasional grunt to the cashier at the general store 15 miles down the road. "Maybe you should get a dog, Dad," Emily had suggested during their last call. "Something to keep you company out there." James had dismissed the idea, but as he stood in the doorway of the empty barn, watching dust motes dance in the morning light, he wondered if she might have been right. The silence had become a living thing, pressing against him from all sides, suffocating him slowly. That was when the call came. Sarah Collins from the local wildlife management office, her voice businesslike but tinged with desperation. "Mr. Mitchell, I understand you have land and an empty stable on your property. We have a situation with a wild Mustang. He was found abandoned near death in Blackwood Canyon, severely malnourished. We believe he escaped from an illegal holding operation. We've treated his immediate medical needs, but we're at capacity, and he needs a place to recover. He's too wild for most facilities, but given your background with horses in the military..." James hadn't worked with horses since his early days in the Marines, before specialized units had replaced cavalry traditions with mechanized alternatives. Those had been trained military animals, not wild Mustangs. Yet he found himself agreeing before he'd fully processed her request. "I'll be there in an hour," he said, surprising himself. The local wildlife management facility was a collection of modest buildings surrounded by various enclosures. Sarah, a woman in her 40s with practical clothes and a no-nonsense ponytail, led James to the furthest pen. Inside, a once magnificent horse stood with his head lowered, ribs clearly visible beneath a dull white coat covered with dust and grime. "We've named him Ghost," Sarah explained, "because of his coloring and the fact that he nearly died out there. Nobody reported him missing. We think he might have been captured from the wild herds, possibly for illegal sale, then abandoned when he proved too difficult to handle or when authorities got close." James approached the fence cautiously. Ghost raised his head, revealing dark, wary eyes that met James's with unmistakable caution. The horse's body tensed, ready for flight or fight. "He hasn't let anyone touch him," Sarah continued. "We had to sedate him for medical treatment. The vet says he's about 7 years old. No visible brands or markings. He's severely malnourished, has some infected cuts that need continued treatment, and shows signs of mistreatment. Physically, he should recover with proper care. Mentally, she shrugged. That's harder to predict. James recognized something in the horse's eyes, a wariness, a distrust of the world and everything in it. It was like looking in a mirror. I'm not a rehabilitation expert, James said quietly. I haven't worked with horses in decades. Sarah nodded. I understand, but we're out of options. Ghost needs space, quiet, and time, things our facility can't provide right now. He also needs someone patient enough to just be there. No expectations, just presence. The words hit James with unexpected force. Wasn't that exactly what he'd needed when he came home? Space, quiet, time, and presence without expectation? I have medication instructions, feeding guidelines, and the vet's contact information, Sarah continued, mistaking his silence for consideration. We'll cover feed costs for the first month, and the vet will make house calls initially. James watched Ghost shifting nervously in the enclosure, maintaining maximum distance from them. The animal's eyes never left him, assessing, calculating, remembering past hurts, and anticipating new ones. How do I get him to my place? James asked finally. Relief flooded Sarah's face. We have a trailer. He doesn't load easily, but we can manage with sedation. Light enough that he can travel safely, but will be fully alert when he arrives. 3 hours later, James stood in his barnyard as the trailer backed up to the entrance of his newly cleared stable. Ghost had emerged from sedation during the journey, and now the trailer rocked slightly with his nervous movements. We'll open the door and then step back, Sarah instructed. Let him come out on his own terms. The enclosure is secure? James nodded. He'd spent the morning checking the fencing around the attached paddock, making sure the gate mechanisms worked, and that there were no hazardous objects in either the stable or the yard. Sarah unlocked the trailer and carefully swung the door open before retreating to stand beside James. For long minutes, nothing happened. Then cautiously, Ghost appeared at the trailer entrance. His nostrils flared as he took in the new environment, his powerful body tense with readiness to flee at the first sign of danger. With deliberate slowness, the horse descended the ramp. Upon reaching the ground, he trotted away from them to the furthest corner of the paddock where he stood watching them, his white coat gleaming in the afternoon sun despite its poor condition. Remember, Sarah said quietly, no sudden movements, no loud noises. Establish a routine. Food and water in the same place, same time every day. Just let him observe you going about your business. Don't approach him directly. Let him decide when he's ready for more. After Sarah left, James pulled a chair from the house and placed it just inside the barn door, where he could see Ghost but was far enough away not to spook him. The horse remained in his corner, vigilant and untrusting. Well, James said, his voice rough from disuse. I guess it's just you and me now. Ghost's ears flicked toward the sound, but otherwise he remained motionless. James settled into the chair, feeling something stir within him for the first time in months, a sense of purpose, however small. The broken man and the wild horse regarded each other across the paddock, two wounded souls at the beginning of a journey neither one of them had anticipated. The first week passed in a silent standoff. James established a routine as Sarah had suggested, filling Ghost's water trough and leaving hay in the same spot each morning and evening. He moved slowly, speaking in a low, monotonous voice, narrating his actions as if the horse could understand his words. Ghost remained vigilant, retreating to his corner whenever James entered the paddock, dark eyes tracking every movement. James found himself rising earlier each morning, the responsibility of another living creature forcing structure into days that had previously blurred together. He'd wake before dawn, make coffee, and sit on the porch watching the sun rise over the eastern hills. Then he'd prepare Ghost's morning feed, adding the supplements the vet had prescribed for weight gain and muscle development. On the seventh day, as James poured grain into the feeding trough, he glanced up to find Ghost standing closer than ever before, still a safe distance away, but close enough that James could see the fine tremor in the horse's muscles, the battle between fear and hunger playing out in real time. "It's all right," James said softly, backing away slowly. "Take your time. No one's rushing you here." He retreated to his chair by the barn door, a spot that had become something of a sanctuary. He'd brought out an old radio that now played classical music at low volume and a stack of books he'd ordered online, texts about wild horse behavior, rehabilitation techniques, and equine psychology. Sometimes he read aloud, letting Ghost become accustomed to the sound of his voice. That evening, as the light faded from the sky, James watched Ghost approach the feeding trough after he'd backed away. The horse ate quickly, ears constantly moving, ready to flee at the slightest provocation. It wasn't trust, not by a long shot, but it was something. "Small victories," James murmured to himself. That night he called his daughter without being prompted. "Dad?" Emily answered, surprise evident in her voice. "Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine," he said, realizing how rarely he initiated contact. I have a horse now." The silence on the other end stretched long enough that James wondered if the call had dropped. "You have a what?" Emily finally asked. James explained about Ghost, keeping the details simple. He didn't mention his own recognition in the horse's wary eyes or how having a purpose, however small, had given him a reason to get out of bed for 7 consecutive days, the longest streak since his return. "That's actually good, I think," Emily said cautiously. "Do you need anything? I could drive up this weekend, help with setting things up." James considered the offer. A month ago, he would have declined immediately, unwilling to let his daughter see the shell he'd become. Now he found himself hesitating. "If you want to," he said finally. "The horse isn't much for company yet, but I'll come Saturday," she said, and James heard the smile in her voice. "I'll bring groceries." The next morning, a thunderstorm rolled in before dawn. James woke to the crash of thunder and the sound of rain hammering against the roof. His first thought was of Ghost. Wild horses weren't accustomed to confinement during storms. Pulling on a raincoat, James hurried to the barn. The paddock was empty. Heart racing, he feared Ghost had somehow escaped, but then he spotted movement in the darkened barn. Ghost had sought shelter inside, but he was far from calm. The horse paced in agitation, his hooves striking the ground with sharp, panicked sounds. Each thunderclap caused him to flinch and snort. James stood in the doorway, water dripping from his coat. Ghost noticed him and retreated further into the barn, trembling visibly now. Without thinking, James began to talk, his voice low and steady. "I know about storms," he said. "Not just the weather kind, the kind that hit you from nowhere, that roll through your mind when you least expect it." He moved to his chair, sat down, and continued talking, sharing things he'd never told anyone. Not the VA therapist, not Emily, not even his fellow Marines. He spoke of the storms in his mind, the flashbacks that still woke him in cold sweats, the guilt that weighed on him like a physical presence. "Some days the noise in my head is so loud I can barely think," he admitted to the frightened horse. "Some days I wonder why I made it back when better men didn't." Thunder crashed overhead and Ghost startled, but his eyes remained fixed on James. Whether it was the continuous sound of his voice or something else, the horse seemed to be listening. "The thing about storms," James continued, "is they always pass. That's what they told me in therapy. Doesn't feel like it when you're in the middle of one, but it's true. They do pass." By the time the storm moved on, Ghost had stopped pacing. He stood in the center of the barn, still alert but no longer in panic. James fell silent, realizing he'd been talking for nearly an hour. His throat felt raw, but something else felt lighter, as if the words, once spoken aloud, had lost some of their power over him. That evening, the vet arrived for his scheduled checkup. Dr. Winters was a practical man in his 50s who spoke to Ghost in the same no-nonsense tone he used with James. "He's putting on weight," the vet noted approvingly. "Not letting you touch him yet, though, I see." James shook his head. "Not yet." "Well, I need to check those cuts on his flank. They were at risk of infection." They set up a temporary chute with panels borrowed from a neighboring farm, gently guiding Ghost into the confined space where Dr. Winters could examine him without risking a kick. Ghost trembled throughout the examination, his eyes rolling white with fear, but he didn't fight as desperately as he had during previous examinations. "The wounds are healing well," Dr. Winters said afterward. "Another week of antibiotics to be safe, but the progress is good, physically at least." He glanced at James. "The mental healing takes longer." "I know," James replied quietly. After the vet left, James returned to the paddock with a curry comb in hand. He didn't approach Ghost directly, but began methodically cleaning the brushes and grooming tools that had been gathering dust since his uncle's time. He worked unhurriedly, occasionally glancing at Ghost, who watched from a distance. "No rush," James said. "We've got nothing but time here." That night, James slept without nightmares for the first time in months. He woke to sunlight streaming through his bedroom window, momentarily disoriented by the absence of the familiar weight of dread that had greeted him each morning for as long as he could remember. In the paddock, Ghost was waiting. The horse still maintained his distance, but when James appeared with the morning feed, he noticed something different. Ghost's head was higher, his ears forward instead of flattened in fear. The horse took a single step toward him before stopping, as if surprised by his own boldness. James smiled, a small, rusty gesture that felt foreign on his face. "Good morning to you too," he said. Saturday arrived clear and bright. James spent the morning cleaning the house, not thoroughly, but enough that Emily wouldn't worry more than she already did. Around noon, he heard tires on the gravel driveway and stepped onto the porch to see his daughter's car pulling up. Emily emerged, a petite woman with her father's determined jaw and her mother's gentle eyes. She paused, studying James with a look he recognized, the careful assessment she always made, gauging his mental state before proceeding. What she saw made her eyebrows rise slightly. James knew he still looked rough, his silver hair too long, his frame too thin. But something had changed, and Emily sensed it immediately. "Dad," she said, smiling cautiously, "you look better." James shrugged, uncomfortable with the observation but unable to deny it. "Come on," he said gruffly. "There's someone I want you to meet." Emily stood at the paddock fence, a respectful distance from Ghost, who eyed her with the same suspicion he'd initially shown James. The horse had retreated to his familiar corner, head high, nostrils flared as he assessed this new human. "He's beautiful," she said softly. "Even with how thin he still is, you can see what he'll look like when he's healthy again." James nodded, leaning against the fence beside her. "The vet says he's improving physically. The rest will take time." Emily turned to study her father's profile. The haunted look hadn't left his eyes entirely, but there was something different, a focus that had been absent during her previous visits. She'd grown accustomed to finding him staring into space, barely registering her presence. Now he seemed present, engaged with the world around him. "How are you sleeping?" she asked carefully. James shrugged. "Better, some nights." It wasn't much of an answer, but Emily knew better than to push. Her father had never been one for discussing feelings, even before the depression set in. 28 years in the Marines had taught him to compartmentalize, to push emotions down deep, where they couldn't interfere with the mission. That habit had served him well in combat zones, but had become part of the problem in civilian life. "Let me make dinner," she offered. "I brought groceries like I promised." Over a simple meal of roast chicken and vegetables, Emily filled the silence with stories from her job as a high school counselor in the city. James listened more attentively than he had in months, occasionally asking questions that showed he was following the conversation. "One of my students is interested in joining the Marines," Emily mentioned, watching her father carefully. "His parents are against it. They asked if I could talk him out of it." James set down his fork. "What did you tell them?" "That it wasn't my job to make that decision for him. That military service can be a positive path for the right person." She hesitated. "I thought about suggesting he talk to you, actually." James's expression closed. "I'm not the right person for that conversation." "Why not? You served honorably for nearly 3 decades, and look how I ended up." The words came out harsher than he intended. Emily's face softened. "Dad, what you're going through, it doesn't erase all the good you did, all the people you helped." James pushed his plate away, uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. "I need to check on Ghost before it gets too dark." Emily sighed but didn't press the issue. As James stood, she asked, "Can I come with you?" Together they walked to the barn in the fading light. Ghost was inside, having learned that the barn meant shelter and relative safety. He shifted nervously at their approach, but didn't retreat to the far corner as he had before. "He's getting used to routine," James explained, keeping his voice low. "Predictability helps him feel secure." Emily watched as her father prepared Ghost's evening feed, noting the careful, deliberate movements and the constant, soft monologue he maintained. There was a gentleness to him she hadn't seen in years, perhaps ever. "You know," she said as they walked back to the house afterward, "when the school counselor suggested I follow in her footsteps, you told me I'd always been good at listening to people's problems, but terrible at keeping my opinions to myself." James gave a short laugh. "I remember. You also said that sometimes people don't need advice. They just need someone to be present while they figure things out for themselves." She glanced at him. "Seems like that's what you're doing for Ghost." James hadn't considered it that way, but Emily's observation resonated. He wasn't trying to fix Ghost. He was simply providing space, consistency, and companionship without demand or expectation. That night, after Emily had gone to bed in the spare room, James sat on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the stars emerge in the clear night sky. For the first time in months, the crushing weight of his thoughts seemed lighter, not gone. He wasn't naive enough to believe recovery happened that quickly, but manageable, at least for the moment. The next morning, Emily joined him for the early feeding. Ghost seemed to have accepted her presence, though he still maintained a careful distance. As James poured grain into the trough, Emily gasped softly, "Dad, look." Ghost was approaching while James was still near the trough, something he'd never done before. The horse moved cautiously, muscles tense and ready for flight, but his desire for food was overcoming his fear. James remained perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe as Ghost stretched his neck to reach the grain, maintaining as much distance as possible between himself and the human standing just 4 feet away. "That's it," James whispered. "Good boy." Ghost's ear flicked toward the sound, but he continued eating, his dark eye watching James warily. It was a small breakthrough, but significant. When Emily left that afternoon, she hugged her father tightly. "I'll come back in 2 weeks," she promised. "Maybe I can stay a little longer next time." James nodded, surprised to find he was looking forward to her return. "Drive safe." As her car disappeared down the driveway, James felt the familiar pang of isolation, but it was tempered now by purpose. He had the evening feeding to prepare and a new idea to try. Over the next few days, James continued the slow, patient work of earning Ghost's trust. He began spending more time in the paddock, not approaching the horse directly, but simply existing in the same space, reading aloud or doing small maintenance tasks. Ghost grew accustomed to his presence, the distance between them gradually shrinking. One morning, a week after Emily's visit, James brought a brush into the paddock. He sat on an upturned bucket in the center of the space, placed the brush on the ground beside him, and began reading from a dog-eared copy of The Old Man and the Sea. Ghost, as usual, kept his distance, grazing at the far end of the paddock but keeping an eye on James. An hour passed this way. James read steadily, occasionally glancing up to see Ghost had moved a few steps closer, then a few more. By midday, the horse stood just 20 feet away, his curiosity seemingly piqued by the human who made no demands of him. James set his book down and picked up the brush. "This might help with that patchy coat of yours," he said conversationally. "No rush. Whenever you're ready." He placed the brush on the ground a few feet in front of him, then returned to his reading. Ghost watched, ears forward with interest. Another half-hour passed before the horse approached the brush, sniffing it cautiously. James continued reading, pretending not to notice, though his heart pounded with anticipation. Ghost nudged the brush with his nose, then startled at the movement he'd caused. After a moment, he returned, investigating the unfamiliar object. James slowly set his book aside and reached for the brush, telegraphing his movements clearly. "Just going to show you what it's for," he said softly. Ghost backed up several steps but didn't flee. James brushed his own arm with the soft bristles, then set the brush down again and resumed reading. This pattern continued throughout the afternoon, James demonstrating, then retreating, giving Ghost time to process each new development. As the sun began to set, James stood, preparing to leave the paddock. He'd placed the brush back on the ground near Ghost, who had ventured close enough that James could have reached out and touched him, though he made no attempt to do so. "Same time tomorrow," James said, turning to go. He'd taken only a few steps when he felt a soft, warm breath on the back of his neck. James froze, heart hammering in his chest. Slowly, carefully, he turned his head. Ghost stood directly behind him, close enough that James could see the individual whiskers on his muzzle, the long eyelashes framing his dark eyes. For a breathless moment, they regarded each other. Then Ghost stretched his neck forward and gently, tentatively, touched his nose to James's outstretched hand. James didn't move, hardly dared to breathe, as Ghost's velvet muzzle pressed against his palm. The touch was feather-light, a question more than a statement, ready to withdraw at the slightest provocation. James held perfectly still, his weathered hand cupped slightly to receive this extraordinary gift of trust. "Hey there," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "That's a good boy." The moment stretched, suspended in the golden light of sunset. Then Ghost stepped back, regarding James with wary eyes that nonetheless held something new, a flicker of curiosity, perhaps even the faintest beginning of trust. The horse turned and walked unhurriedly to the water trough, as if nothing momentous had occurred. But something had. That night, James sat at his kitchen table making notes in the journal he'd started keeping about Ghost's progress. His handwriting, once sharp and precise from decades of military reports, had grown uneven during his depression. Now it steadied as he meticulously recorded the day's breakthrough. "First physical contact initiated by Ghost," he wrote. "Duration approximately 5 seconds. No signs of distress afterward." He paused, pen hovering above the page, then added, "I felt something too. Hard to describe. Like finding something I didn't know was missing." The next morning, James woke before dawn as usual, but the heavy weight that typically pressed him into the mattress felt lighter. He made coffee and took it to the porch, watching the eastern sky gradually lighten. His mind drifted to the VA therapist he'd stopped seeing months ago. Dr. Abernathy had talked about meaningful connection and purpose and concepts that had seemed hollow and unattainable then. James wondered what she would make of his connection with Ghost. When he entered the paddock with the morning feed, Ghost acknowledged his presence with a raised head and forward ears, a far cry from the fearful retreat of weeks past. James set the feed bucket down and stepped back, giving the horse space. To his surprise, Ghost approached while he was still nearby, maintaining a cautious distance but clearly less afraid. "Morning," James said softly. "Sleep well?" Ghost's ear flicked toward the sound, and James had the distinct impression the horse was listening, not just hearing. He continued talking as he filled the water trough, describing the weather forecast, mentioning Emily's planned return visit, speaking of small, inconsequential things in a steady, calm voice. Ghost ate, occasionally glancing up as if to confirm James's whereabouts, but no longer with the hypervigilance of constant fear. Over the next few days, James spent increasing amounts of time in the paddock. He brought the brush each day, leaving it within Ghost's reach but making no attempt to use it on the horse. Sometimes he read aloud, other times he simply sat in companionable silence. Ghost gradually ventured closer, his curiosity seemingly piqued by this human who asked nothing of him. One afternoon, James dozed off while sitting on his bucket, lulled by the warm sun and the peaceful atmosphere. He woke to the sensation of breath on his face. Opening his eyes, he found Ghost standing over him, examining him with intense interest. James remained motionless, heart pounding, as the horse lowered his head until their faces were inches apart. "Well, hello there," James said softly. Ghost snorted gently, his breath warm against James's skin, then stepped back, apparently satisfied with his investigation. James slowly raised his hand, palm up in invitation. Ghost considered the gesture, then lowered his muzzle to touch James's hand briefly before moving away to graze. These moments of connection, though brief, began occurring with increasing frequency. By the time Emily returned for her promised visit 2 weeks later, Ghost would regularly approach James in the paddock, sometimes standing nearby as James read or worked, other times initiating brief moments of physical contact. Emily arrived on a Friday afternoon, bringing more groceries and a stack of books she thought her father might enjoy. She noticed the changes in him immediately. He stood straighter, his movements more purposeful than they had been in years. There was color in his face, and though the haunted look hadn't left his eyes entirely, it had receded. "You look good, Dad," she said, as they walked to the barn. James shrugged, uncomfortable with the observation, but not denying it. "Been keeping busy." The transformation in Ghost was equally striking. Though still underweight, his coat had begun to shine with improved nutrition and health. He held his head higher and, while still cautious, no longer appeared constantly poised for flight. "He's a different horse," Emily marveled. "The vet must be pleased with his progress." "Dr. Winters says he's doing well physically," James confirmed. "His cuts have healed completely. He's gained nearly 100 pounds. Still has a way to go, but he's getting there." As they approached the paddock, Ghost raised his head from grazing and focused on them. Emily tensed, expecting him to retreat as he had during her last visit. Instead, after a moment's consideration, the horse walked toward them, stopping a respectful distance from the fence. "He remembers you," James said, unable to keep the pride from his voice. Emily watched in amazement as her father entered the paddock, and Ghost approached him directly, lowering his head to allow James to gently stroke his neck. The interaction was brief. Ghost soon moved away to resume grazing, but its significance wasn't lost on her. "That's incredible," she said softly. "Have you thought about what happens next? With his rehabilitation, I mean." James hadn't allowed himself to think too far ahead. Each day with Ghost had been about the present moment, the small victories, the incremental building of trust. The question of what came after recovery wasn't one he'd been ready to face. Sarah mentioned eventually finding him a permanent home, he said, discomfort evident in his voice. Somewhere with experience handling formerly wild horses. And that wouldn't be here? Emily asked carefully. James looked away. I'm not qualified. This place isn't set up for permanent equine care. I was just meant to help with his recovery. Emily studied her father's profile, noting the tension in his jaw. You've done more than help with his recovery, Dad. You've connected with him. That doesn't mean I'm equipped to provide what he needs long-term. The conversation was interrupted by the ringing of James's phone, Dr. Winters calling to reschedule his upcoming visit. After the call, James seemed distracted, his earlier openness replaced by a familiar reserve. Emily recognized the signs. Her father was retreating into himself again, likely wrestling with thoughts he wasn't ready to share. That evening, after a quiet dinner, Emily found James on the porch, staring into the darkness. What's really bothering you about Ghost's future? She asked, settling into the chair beside him. James was silent for so long she thought he might not answer. Finally, he sighed. I was supposed to help him heal. I didn't expect... He trailed off, struggling to find the words. You didn't expect to need him as much as he needed you. Emily finished gently. James nodded, his face partially hidden in shadow. What happens when he doesn't need me anymore? When he's healthy enough to move on? Emily heard the real question beneath his words. What purpose would he have then? What would fill the emptiness that Ghost had temporarily alleviated? Maybe he'll always need you, she suggested, just in different ways, and maybe that's okay. James didn't respond, but Emily noticed how his fingers worried at the edge of his sleeve, a nervous habit from childhood that resurfaced when he was deeply troubled. She reached over and covered his hand with hers. It's not just about Ghost, is it? She asked softly. James shook his head, still not meeting her eyes. Nothing is permanent, Em. People leave, they die, they forget you. I spent my whole life serving something bigger than myself, and when it was over, he gestured vaguely, encompassing the isolated farmhouse, the years of solitude, the depression that had nearly consumed him. Ghost showed up when you needed something to care for, Emily said. Maybe that's not a coincidence. The nightmare came without warning, as they always did. James was back in Fallujah, the heat pressing against him like a physical weight, the taste of dust thick in his mouth. The convoy ahead disappeared in a flash of blinding light, the concussive force of the IED slamming through his body. Screams, radio chatter, the coppery smell of blood, his men, his responsibility, dying around him while he remained frozen, unable to move, unable to help. James woke with a strangled cry, sheets tangled around his legs, sweat-soaked and disoriented. For a moment, he didn't know where or when he was, the memories so vivid they seemed more real than the darkened bedroom around him. His heart hammered painfully against his ribs, each breath a conscious effort. Emily appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the hall light. Dad, are you okay? James sat up, pressing the heels of his hands against his eyes. I'm fine, go back to sleep. But Emily had grown up with a Marine for a father. She recognized an order given to protect rather than command. Instead of leaving, she crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed, a respectful distance away but present nonetheless. Same one? She asked quietly. James nodded, not trusting his voice. They sat in silence for several minutes while his breathing gradually slowed. The digital clock on the nightstand read 3:17 a.m. I'm going to check on Ghost, he said finally, reaching for the jeans draped over a nearby chair. Emily didn't argue. I'll make some tea. The night air was cool against his skin as James made his way to the barn, the motion-activated security lights illuminating the path. His legs felt unsteady beneath him, the aftermath of adrenaline leaving him shaky and vulnerable. The barn door slid open with a familiar creak, and James stepped into the comforting darkness, breathing in the scent of hay and horse. Ghost was awake, his white coat almost luminous in the dim light filtering through the windows. The horse watched as James sank onto a hay bale, his energy suddenly depleted. "Sorry to disturb you," James murmured. "Bad night." Ghost remained where he was, watching with that uncanny stillness wild horses possessed. James closed his eyes, focusing on his breathing the way Dr. Abernathy had taught him. In for 4 counts, hold for 7, out for 8. A technique he'd once dismissed as useless but now grasped at like a drowning man. When he opened his eyes again, Ghost had moved closer, standing just a few feet away. The horse's presence was oddly comforting, a silent witness to James's vulnerability, who offered neither judgment nor unwanted consolation. "You know about nightmares too, don't you?" James said softly. "I see it sometimes when you're sleeping. The way your legs twitch, like you're running from something." Ghost lowered his head slightly, as if in acknowledgement. James extended his hand slowly, and after a moment's consideration, Ghost stepped forward to touch his muzzle to James's palm. The contact grounded him, pulling him firmly back into the present moment. They remained that way for several minutes, connected by touch and shared understanding. Then Ghost moved away to return to his hay, and James felt steady enough to go back to the house. Emily was waiting on the porch with 2 steaming mugs. She handed one to James without comment, and they sat side by side in the pre-dawn darkness. "Ghost helped," James said after a while, surprising himself with the admission. Emily nodded, as if this made perfect sense. "Animals know things we don't. They can sense what we need." "I never told you what happened," James said, the words emerging unbidden. "In Fallujah, the last mission." Emily went very still beside him. Her father had never spoken about the events that had precipitated his early retirement, the incident that had left him with a Purple Heart and a medical discharge. "You don't have to." "I want to," James interrupted. "I think I need to." So he told her, in halting sentences that grew steadier as he continued, about the ambush that had killed 4 of his men, about the young Marine, barely 20, who had died in his arms despite James's desperate attempts to save him, about the letter he'd written to the boy's parents, words that felt hollow and insufficient in the face of their loss. "His name was David Taylor," James said, his voice rough with emotion. "He had a fiancée waiting for him back home, a full scholarship to Michigan State when his tour was up. He was brilliant, funny, had his whole life ahead of him." Emily listened without interrupting, tears streaming silently down her face. "I was their commanding officer," James continued. "They were my responsibility, and I couldn't save them. It wasn't your fault, Dad. Logically, I know that, but here," he tapped his chest, "here I still feel like I failed them." As the eastern sky began to lighten, James felt something shift within him. Not healing exactly. He wasn't naive enough to believe that naming his trauma would magically cure it, but a loosening, as if a knot that had been pulled painfully tight for years had been given a fraction of slack. They watched the sun rise together, each lost in their own thoughts. When the first golden rays touched the paddock fence, James stood. "Time for Ghost's breakfast," he said. Later that morning, Sarah Collins from Wildlife Management called. Her voice was cheerful as she delivered what she clearly thought was good news. "We've found a potential permanent placement for Ghost," she announced. "A sanctuary in Montana that specializes in rehabilitated wild horses. They have over 3,000 acres of land, expert staff with experience in trauma recovery for horses, and a small herd of former Mustangs that could provide socialization." James's hand tightened on the phone. "When?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. They have space available in about a month. That should give Ghost time to continue gaining weight and building trust. They've reviewed his case file and are very optimistic about his prospects for full rehabilitation. I see. Something in his tone must have alerted Sarah that her news wasn't being received as expected. Mr. Mitchell, I thought you'd be pleased. This is the best possible outcome for Ghost. Of course, James said automatically. It sounds like an excellent facility. After he hung up, James stood in the kitchen, a peculiar hollowness expanding in his chest. He'd known from the beginning that his role in Ghost's life was temporary, a stepping stone on the horse's journey to recovery. That had been the arrangement. It made perfect sense to move Ghost to a facility better equipped to address his long-term needs. So why did it feel like he was losing something essential? Emily found him still standing there several minutes later, staring unseeing at the wall. Dad? What's wrong? James explained Sarah's call in short, clipped sentences. Emily listened, her expression thoughtful. And you don't want him to go, she said. It wasn't a question. It doesn't matter what I want. The plan was always for Ghost to move on once he was stable enough. Plans can change, Emily pointed out. You've made incredible progress with him. Maybe the best place for him is right here. James shook his head. This is a small operation. I don't have the resources or expertise that Sanctuary has. But you have something they don't, Emily countered. A bond with Ghost. A relationship built on trust. That's not nothing, Dad. James moved to the window, looking out at the paddock where Ghost grazed peacefully. The horse had come so far from the terrified, malnourished creature that had arrived 3 weeks ago. They both had. I'll call Sarah back, Emily said when James remained silent. Ask her if there are options. Maybe a trial period where Ghost stays here with professional support, or regular evaluations to ensure his needs are being met. James nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The thought of Ghost leaving created a physical ache in his chest, a preemptive grief he hadn't anticipated. Somehow, without his noticing, the horse had become more than a rehabilitation project. He had become a companion, a confidant, a reason to get up each morning, and James wasn't ready to let that go. Emily made the call to Sarah while James went out to the paddock, seeking Ghost's steady presence to calm his racing thoughts. The horse greeted him with a soft nicker, a sound that never failed to lift James's spirits. Ghost had begun vocalizing more in recent days, another sign of his growing comfort and security. Hey, buddy, James said, voice rough with emotion. Guess you'll be moving on soon. Big fancy Sanctuary waiting for you. Ghost approached, ears pricked forward with interest. James held out an apple sliced into quarters, a treat Ghost had recently learned to accept from his hand. The horse's lips delicately plucked the fruit from his palm, the gentle touch a reminder of how far they'd come together. You'll like it there, James continued, though the words felt hollow. Thousands of acres to run, other horses for company. Ghost finished the apple and remained close, seemingly content in James's presence. The horse that had once trembled at human proximity now actively sought it out, at least with James. The transformation was remarkable, a testament to patience and consistent care. But was it enough? James wrestled with the question as he stroked Ghost's neck. Had he truly given the horse what he needed, or was he selfishly holding on to Ghost because of what the animal gave him? The Sanctuary would offer resources James couldn't provide. Specialized care, the company of other horses, vast open spaces. Yet something told him Ghost needed more than just physical resources. The horse had suffered trauma beyond physical abuse. He'd been betrayed by humans, abandoned when he became inconvenient. Wouldn't sending him away now, just as he'd learned to trust again, reinforce that lesson? Emily found him still in the paddock an hour later, sitting on his upturned bucket while Ghost grazed nearby, occasionally wandering over to check on James. I spoke with Sarah, she said, leaning against the fence. She wasn't thrilled, but she's willing to consider alternatives. James looked up, not daring to hope. What kind of alternatives? She's coming out tomorrow to evaluate Ghost's progress and discuss options. She mentioned a potential foster-to-adopt arrangement with regular check-ins from their staff. Foster-to-adopt, James repeated, the term simultaneously appealing and intimidating. It implied a commitment beyond the temporary arrangement he'd initially agreed to, a permanence he hadn't allowed himself to consider. It's not definite, Emily cautioned. She wants to see Ghost's condition herself, and they'd need to assess whether this environment meets his long-term needs, but it's on the table. That night, James barely slept, his mind churning with possibilities and doubts. Could he provide what Ghost needed long-term? Was he stable enough himself to take on such responsibility? What if his depression worsened again? What if he failed Ghost as he felt he'd failed his men? By morning, he was exhausted but resolute. He would let the professionals determine what was best for Ghost, regardless of his own wishes. The horse's welfare had to come first. Sarah arrived mid-morning, clipboard in hand, her practical ponytail and no-nonsense boots unchanged from their first meeting. James greeted her at the gate, conscious of the property's modest appearance compared to a professional sanctuary. "Mr. Mitchell," she said with a nod. "Emily mentioned you have concerns about Ghost's placement. I just want what's best for him," James replied carefully. "I understand the sanctuary offers resources I can't match." Sarah's expression softened slightly. "That's true, but resources aren't everything. Let's see how he's doing." They walked to the paddock where Ghost was sunning himself in the morning light. At their approach, he raised his head, ears forward with interest rather than flattened with fear. When he spotted James, he walked directly toward them. Sarah's eyebrows rose. "Well, that's certainly different from when I last saw him." "He's come a long way," James acknowledged, unable to keep the pride from his voice. They entered the paddock together. Ghost approached James first, touching his muzzle to James's outstretched hand in what had become their standard greeting. Then, surprisingly, he turned his attention to Sarah, sniffing her cautiously but without the terror he'd shown at their first meeting. "Remarkable," Sarah murmured, standing perfectly still as Ghost investigated her. "His body language is completely transformed." For the next hour, Sarah observed Ghost's behavior, his physical condition, and his interactions with James. She took notes, asked questions about his daily routine, and examined the facilities with a critical eye. "His weight gain is excellent," she commented. "Coat condition improving. The scars will remain, but they've healed cleanly." Finally, she closed her notebook and faced James directly. "I have to admit, Mr. Mitchell, I'm impressed. Ghost has made more progress here than I anticipated." "Thank you," James said, feeling a cautious hope rising within him. "That said, there are legitimate concerns about long-term care. Ghost will need ongoing professional monitoring, proper nutrition, adequate exercise, and ideally, socialization with other equines." James nodded, bracing himself for the verdict. "However," Sarah continued, "given the exceptional bond he's formed with you, relocating him could potentially cause significant setbacks. The trust you've established is valuable therapeutic progress that shouldn't be dismissed." She tapped her notebook thoughtfully. "I'm recommending a modified plan. Ghost stays here, with quarterly evaluations from our team and a care plan developed by our equine specialists. You'll need to make some improvements, a larger shelter for winter, proper fencing for the north section of the property, additional nutritional supplements." James felt a weight lift from his chest. "I can do that, all of it." "There's more," Sarah cautioned. "Horses are herd animals. Ghost needs socialization. There's a rescue organization about 30 miles from here that has a companion horse program. Older, gentle horses who can teach ghost-appropriate equine behavior. Would you be open to adopting a second horse? The question caught James off guard. One horse had already transformed his daily existence in ways he hadn't imagined possible. Two would mean an even greater commitment, more responsibility, more potential for both connection and loss. I would need to think about that, he said honestly. Sarah nodded. Understandable. It's not a requirement, but a strong recommendation. In the meantime, I'll draw up the paperwork for the foster arrangement. If all goes well for 6 months, we can discuss permanent adoption. After Sarah left, James sat on the porch, absorbing the morning's developments. Emily brought him coffee and settled into the chair beside him. "You okay?" she asked. "Yeah," James said, surprised to find it was true. "I am." "So Ghost stays," Emily said, smiling. "For now, at least. 6-month trial period." Emily studied her father's face. "You're worried about something else?" James sighed. His daughter had always been perceptive, even as a child. "Sarah suggested I consider adopting a companion horse for Ghost for socialization." "And that bothers you?" "What if I can't handle it, Em? What if the depression comes back or the nightmares get worse and I can't take care of them properly? What if—" "Dad," Emily interrupted gently, "you've been taking care of Ghost through your bad days and good days. You got up every morning, fed him, talked to him, spent time with him, even when it was hard. That's different. That was temporary. This would be a commitment." Emily reached for his hand. "Life is full of commitments we can't guarantee we'll always be able to keep perfectly. What matters is that we try our best, and that we ask for help when we need it." James gazed out at the paddock where Ghost grazed peacefully in the afternoon sun. "I never planned on any of this," he admitted. "When Sarah called about Ghost, I don't know. I needed something to fill the empty hours. And now?" "Now I need him," James said simply. "That terrifies me." In the days following Sarah's visit, James found himself researching equine companionship with an intensity that surprised him. He read articles about herd dynamics, watched videos of horses interacting in natural settings, and spent hours on the website of the rescue organization Sarah had mentioned, studying the available horses. Emily had returned to the city, but called every evening, her voice a reassuring constant as James navigated this unexpected crossroads. "I found a construction crew to give an estimate on extending the paddock and reinforcing the north fence," he told her one evening. "They can start next week." "That's great, Dad. Have you thought more about the companion horse?" James gazed out the window at Ghost, illuminated by the setting sun. "I've been looking at the rescue's website. There's an older gelding, a quarter horse named Duke, 16 years old, retired from ranch work. Owner couldn't keep him after a stroke. Sounds promising," Emily said. "Are you going to meet him?" "I made an appointment for Friday," James admitted. "Just to see. No commitments." He could hear the smile in Emily's voice. "Of course. Just to see." Friday arrived with clear skies and a gentle breeze. Perfect weather for the hour-long drive to Willow Creek Equine Rescue. James hadn't ventured this far from home in months, and the journey itself felt significant, a step beyond the boundaries he'd created in his isolation. The rescue sat on 20 acres of rolling pasture, modest but well-maintained. Maggie Peterson, the owner, greeted James with a firm handshake and direct gaze. In her 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a practical braid, she radiated the no-nonsense competence of someone who had spent a lifetime around horses. "Sarah mentioned your situation," Maggie said, as she led James toward the paddocks. "Wild Mustang with trust issues needs socialization. Duke might be a good fit. He's got the right temperament, steady, patient, experienced, been around all sorts of horses, never met one he couldn't get along with." They stopped at a paddock where a sturdy chestnut horse grazed peacefully. At Maggie's whistle, Duke raised his head and ambled toward them, his gait showing the slight stiffness of early arthritis, but otherwise strong and confident. "This is Duke," Maggie said. 26 years of wisdom in this old boy." Duke surveyed James with intelligent brown eyes, then stretched his neck over the fence, inviting contact. James extended his hand, and Duke sniffed it thoroughly before nudging it gently. "He's friendly," James observed. "Good-natured by birth, well-trained by experience," Maggie agreed. "His previous owner had him for 15 years, since he was a young ranch horse. Duke only came to us after Mr. Harmon's stroke. He's healthy, aside from some mild arthritis that we manage with supplements. Doesn't need much, good pasture, regular companionship, basic care." As they talked, Duke remained beside them, occasionally butting his head against James's shoulder in a request for attention. The horse's gentle confidence was reassuring, a stark contrast to Ghost's initial terror. "I'm not sure I'm qualified to care for 2 horses," James admitted. "Ghost is my first, and that was supposed to be temporary." Maggie considered him thoughtfully. "Sarah speaks highly of what you've accomplished with Ghost, says you've got good instincts. Duke here doesn't need an expert, just someone consistent and kind. He'd be an excellent teacher for your Ghost. Show him how to be a proper horse again." They spent an hour with Duke, Maggie demonstrating his training and answering James's questions. By the time they returned to the office to discuss logistics, James had made his decision. "I'd like to try," he said. "If you think we're a good match." Maggie nodded approvingly. "I do. How about we start with a 2-week trial? I'll bring Duke to your place, help introduce him to Ghost, and see how they interact. If all goes well, we can discuss a permanent arrangement." The following Tuesday, Maggie's truck and trailer pulled into James's driveway. Ghost, who had grown accustomed to James's pickup, eyed the unfamiliar vehicle warily from the paddock. "Take it slow," Maggie advised as they approached the paddock. "Let them see each other before we make any introductions." They led Duke to the fence, allowing Ghost to observe the newcomer from a safe distance. Ghost's posture was alert but not panicked, his curiosity seemingly outweighing his apprehension. "Good signs," Maggie murmured. "He's interested, not frightened. Let's give them time to assess each other." For nearly an hour, the humans stood back while the horses communicated in their subtle language of ear positions, head movements, and body stances. Duke remained calm throughout, occasionally grazing to signal his lack of aggression. Ghost gradually moved closer to the fence, drawn by the presence of another of his kind. "Ready to try them together?" Maggie asked. "We'll put Duke in first, since it's Ghost's territory." James nodded, though his stomach knotted with anxiety. What if Ghost panicked? What if the presence of another horse undid all their careful progress? Maggie led Duke into the paddock, then joined James outside the fence. Duke wandered casually around the enclosure, seemingly unconcerned by Ghost's scrutiny. After several minutes of watchful waiting, Ghost approached, neck extended, nostrils flared to capture Duke's scent. The meeting was anticlimactic in the best way. No dramatic confrontations, no aggressive posturing, just 2 horses taking each other's measure with dignified caution. By evening, they were grazing on opposite sides of the paddock, maintaining distance but without tension. "That went well," Maggie said as she prepared to leave. "I'll check back in a few days. Call me if you have any concerns, but I think these 2 will sort themselves out just fine." After she departed, James sat on the porch watching the horses until darkness fell. The companionable silence between them felt right somehow, each acknowledging the other's presence while respecting boundaries. It reminded him of his early days with Ghost, the careful dance of building trust without pushing too hard. That night, for the first time in longer than he could remember, James felt something close to contentment. Not happiness exactly, that seemed too much to ask, but a quiet satisfaction in having made a decision that felt right, in having expanded his world beyond the tight boundaries of grief and isolation. Over the next few days, the horses established their own routine. Duke, with his years of domestic experience, quickly adapted to the feeding schedule. Ghost observed the older horse carefully, learning from his calm acceptance of human presence. During one morning feeding, James watched in amazement as Ghost followed Duke's example, approaching while James was still pouring the grain rather than waiting for him to retreat. "Teaching him manners already, Duke?" James chuckled. By the end of the first week, the horses had progressed to grazing side by side, occasionally engaging in mutual grooming, a significant sign of trust in the equine world. James captured a photo of them standing together in the morning light, Ghost's white coat contrasting with Duke's rich chestnut, and sent it to Emily. "Looks like a success," she texted back. "How are you feeling about it?" James considered the question carefully before responding. "Good. Right decision." When Maggie returned for her follow-up visit, her approval was evident. "They're bonding nicely," she observed. "Duke's a good influence. See how Ghost is mimicking his body language? That's learning happening right before our eyes." "I'd like to make this permanent," James said, "if you're comfortable with the arrangement." Maggie smiled. "I am. Duke deserves a good retirement home, and I think he's found one. Let's go over his care needs and finalize the paperwork." That evening, after Maggie left and the horses were settled for the night, James called Dr. Abernathy, the VA therapist he'd stopped seeing months earlier. The conversation was brief, but meaningful, an acknowledgement that he was ready to resume the work he'd abandoned when the darkness had been too overwhelming. "I'd like to schedule an appointment," he said. "I've had some changes in my life. I think I'm ready to talk about them." The second month of Ghost's rehabilitation marked a turning point. With Duke's steady influence, the wild Mustang's progress accelerated noticeably. James observed the transformation with quiet amazement, noting how Ghost studied and mimicked the older horse's responses to human interaction. When Duke approached for grooming without hesitation, Ghost watched attentively. The next day, he ventured closer during his own grooming session, allowing James to brush his withers for the first time. When Duke calmly accepted a saddle blanket placed across his back, not for riding, just for desensitization, Ghost's curiosity overcame his fear. Within days, he permitted James to drape a light blanket over him as well, though he still flinched when it first settled on his back. "That's it," James murmured encouragingly. "Nothing to worry about. Duke's showing you the ropes." Dr. Winters, during his monthly visit, remarked on the dramatic improvement. "Remarkable what the right companionship can do," he said, watching the horses graze together. "Duke's teaching Ghost how to be a domestic horse, and Ghost is reminding Duke what it means to be part of a herd. They're good for each other." James nodded, understanding the observation extended beyond the horses. His own re-entry into the world of human connection had begun with Ghost, expanded to include Duke, and now continued with his resumed therapy sessions with Dr. Abernathy. The first appointment had been difficult, acknowledging how far he'd retreated from life, confronting the depth of his depression, revisiting trauma he'd spent years avoiding. But in the weeks that followed, James found himself bringing observations from his work with the horses into their conversations. "Ghost couldn't handle direct eye contact at first," he explained during one session. "Had to approach him sideways, let him come to me on his terms." Dr. Abernathy nodded thoughtfully. "And how does that compare to your own experience with connection?" The question landed with unexpected weight. James considered it carefully. "After I came back, I couldn't handle people looking too closely either. Their concern felt like scrutiny. Their questions felt like accusations." "So you retreated." "I did," James acknowledged. "Seemed easier than trying to explain what I couldn't understand myself." These insights, drawn from his observations of Ghost's behavior, provided a framework for examining his own responses to trauma. The parallels weren't perfect. Human psychology and equine behavior differed in fundamental ways, but the metaphor gave James a language for experiences he'd previously found inexpressible. Emily noticed the changes during her monthly visits. The father, who had once been remote and uncommunicative, now shared stories about the horse's progress, engaged in substantive conversations about her work, and occasionally even laughed, a sound so rare in recent years that it startled them both. "You seem more present," she remarked during her July visit as they sat on the porch watching the horses in the evening light. James nodded, knowing she meant it as more than a casual observation. "Working with Ghost and Duke, it gives me purpose, something to focus on beyond myself." "It's good to see," Emily said simply, reaching for his hand. The summer days settled into a rhythm. James rose early, feeding and tending to the horses before the heat intensified. Mornings were for chores, maintaining fences, mucking stalls, managing the small but growing garden he'd started behind the house. Afternoons were dedicated to training sessions, brief periods where he worked with Ghost on basic handling skills while Duke grazed nearby, providing silent reassurance. Dr. Winters had helped James develop a rehabilitation plan that respected Ghost's wild nature while teaching him essential skills for life among humans. They weren't trying to make him into a riding horse, his background and temperament weren't suited for that, but rather a horse who could be safely handled for routine care. The renovations Sarah had recommended were completed by mid-July. An expanded shelter for winter weather, reinforced fencing for the north pasture, and a small round pen for controlled training sessions. The improvements transformed the modest property into a functional equine facility, and James found unexpected satisfaction in creating a space specifically designed for the horse's well-being. One evening in late July, as thunderclouds gathered on the horizon, James noticed Ghost growing restless. Unlike his early days at the farm, when storms had triggered panic, Ghost now displayed a more natural vigilance, alert but not terrified. James opened the gate to the barn, allowing the horses to seek shelter if they chose. Duke ambled in immediately, familiar with the routine, but Ghost hesitated at the threshold. Thunder rumbled in the distance and the white horse's muscles tensed visibly. James stood quietly inside the barn, offering calm presence without pressure. "Your choice, Ghost," he said softly. "You can come in or stay out. Either way, you're safe here." For several minutes, Ghost remained frozen in indecision, caught between instinct and learned trust. Then Duke gave a soft nicker from inside the barn, a sound James had come to recognize as encouragement. As the first heavy raindrops began to fall, Ghost made his decision, stepping deliberately into the shelter. Instead of retreating to the farthest corner as he once would have, Ghost moved to stand beside Duke, their shoulders nearly touching. James, sitting on his customary hay bale, witnessed the moment with a lump in his throat. This voluntary seeking of comfort, this conscious choice to trust, represented everything they'd been working toward. The storm intensified, rain hammering against the roof while lightning illuminated the barn in stark flashes. James found himself talking softly, not to calm the horses, but to express what he was feeling. "You know, when I first came back from my last deployment, I couldn't handle thunderstorms," he admitted. "The noise, the flashes, too similar to things I'd seen. I'd hide in the basement with a bottle of whiskey and wait for it to pass." The horses listened, ears flicking toward his voice. Ghost's eyes, once wild with fear, now watched him with something like understanding. "My unit psychologist had a theory about trauma," James continued. "Said it's not just the experience that damages you, it's the isolation afterward, the feeling that no one could possibly understand what you've been through." He fell silent, watching the rain through the open barn door. Ghost shifted closer to Duke, seeking reassurance from the older horse's steady presence. The parallel wasn't lost on James. "Maybe that's why you're doing better," he said after a while. "You're not alone anymore. Neither of us is." The storm eventually passed, leaving behind the fresh scent of rain-soaked earth and the gentle dripping of water from the eaves. The horses remained in the barn, apparently content in the shelter they'd chosen. James stayed with them until dusk, the shared experience cementing something that had been building for weeks. A sense of reciprocal healing, of wounds gradually mending through connection rather than isolation. That night, when the nightmares came, they were different. Still vivid, still painful, but no longer all-consuming. When James woke, heart racing and sheets damp with sweat, he focused on his breathing the way Dr. Abernathy had taught him and thought of Ghost. How the horse had learned to face his fears, to trust despite past betrayals, to choose connection over isolation. If Ghost could do it, so could he. August arrived with scorching heat that baked the earth and wilted the garden. James installed misters in the paddock shelter, providing the horses relief from the relentless sun. Each morning, he rose before dawn to complete the heavier chores while the air was still relatively cool, establishing a rhythm that anchored his days. Sarah's quarterly evaluation was scheduled for the second week of the month, marking the official 3-month point of Ghost's rehabilitation. As the date approached, James found himself both eager to show off Ghost progress and anxious about formal assessment. What if Sarah deemed the arrangement insufficient? What if Ghost's improvements weren't enough to justify the foster-to-adopt plan? Emily drove up the day before Sarah's visit, arriving with groceries and a quiet determination to support her father. They spent the evening preparing documentation. James had kept meticulous records of Ghost's weight gain, behavioral changes, and training milestones, complete with photographs showing his transformation from the skeletal, terrified creature who had arrived in May to the still cautious but increasingly confident horse of August. "These are remarkable," Emily said, flipping through the photo timeline. "I forgot how bad he looked when he first came." James nodded, studying a recent image of Ghost standing calmly while he groomed the horse's mane. "He's gained nearly 200 pounds. Coat's healthier. Eyes are brighter." "It's not just the physical changes," Emily observed. "Look at his expression, his posture. He's carrying himself differently." James understood what she meant. The constant vigilance, the perpetual readiness for flight that had characterized Ghost's early days had gradually softened into a more measured awareness. He still startled at unexpected sounds, still had moments of regression when fear temporarily overcame trust. But the baseline had shifted dramatically. The same could be said for James. The heavy fog of depression that had once made each day a burden to be endured rather than lived had thinned considerably. He still had difficult days, still fought the intrusive memories that ambushed him in unguarded moments, but he was learning strategies to manage them, partly through his therapy with Dr. Abernathy, partly through the daily practice of patience and consistent care that the horses required. Sarah arrived promptly at 9 the next morning. Her official demeanor softened as she entered the paddock, and Ghost approached her willingly, investigating the pockets of her vest where she often carried apple slices. "Well, someone's gotten friendly," she remarked, offering Ghost a treat that he accepted delicately from her palm. "Last time I saw him, he wouldn't come within 20 feet of me." "Duke's been a good influence," James explained, nodding toward the chestnut gelding who stood watchfully nearby. "Shows Ghost how things work." Sarah spent nearly 2 hours evaluating both horses' condition, reviewing James's records, and observing Ghost's behavior during basic handling procedures. She took particular interest in the training sessions, watching as James demonstrated how Ghost now accepted touch over most of his body, would pick up each hoof briefly when asked, and would follow a lead rope with minimal tension. "I'm impressed," she said finally, closing her notebook. "When we placed Ghost with you, our best-case scenario was that he'd recover physically, and develop enough trust to be safely handled for basic care. He's exceeded those expectations significantly. James felt a weight lift from his shoulders. So the foster arrangement can continue? More than that, Sarah said, smiling. I'm prepared to approve permanent adoption today if you're ready. Ghost has clearly bonded with you and Duke. Relocating him at this point would be detrimental to his continued progress. The words took a moment to register fully. Permanent, James repeated. Sarah nodded. The adoption would include quarterly check-ins for the first year, then annual evaluations after that, mostly as a formality to ensure his continued well-being. But legally and practically, Ghost would be yours. There was paperwork, of course, liability waivers, care agreements, detailed guidelines for continued rehabilitation. As James signed the final document, a sense of rightness settled over him. 3 months ago, he'd agreed to temporarily house a traumatized wild horse, never imagining how profoundly that decision would alter his life's trajectory. After Sarah left, James and Emily celebrated with a special lunch on the porch, watching the horses graze in the paddock. Duke had taken to standing protectively near Ghost when unfamiliar vehicles approached, a behavior that never failed to touch James, this older, gentle horse who had appointed himself guardian and teacher to his traumatized companion. You know what today is besides the adoption? Emily asked as they finished their meal. James shook his head. 3 months exactly since Ghost arrived. Remember the title of the file Sarah sent over that first day? 3-month rehabilitation plan for traumatized Mustang. James hadn't thought about that initial document in weeks. The structured program it outlined had quickly evolved into something more organic, shaped by Ghost's needs and responses rather than a predetermined timeline. Seems longer, he said, in a good way. Emily studied her father's face. You look better, Dad. More like yourself. James considered this. The person he'd been before, the Marine, the leader, the man whose identity had been so tightly wound around his military service, was gone, transformed by trauma and its aftermath. But perhaps that wasn't entirely a loss. Perhaps the person emerging now, more patient, more attuned to vulnerability in himself and others, was someone worth becoming. Not sure who myself is anymore, he admitted, but I'm figuring it out. That evening, after Emily departed with promises to return soon, James sat on his customary hay bale in the barn watching Ghost and Duke in the paddock as the sun set. The relationship between the horses had evolved into something beautiful to witness. Duke's steady presence providing security, Ghost's growing confidence allowing him to initiate play that added vitality to the older horse's days. James thought about the adoption papers sitting on his kitchen table. Ghost was officially his now, not a temporary rehabilitation project, not a responsibility he could hand off when it became inconvenient, but a commitment he had chosen to make. The realization was both sobering and freeing. 3 months ago, he'd barely been able to commit to getting out of bed each morning. Now he had deliberately bound his future to these creatures who depended on him, who had come to trust him despite their own wounds and wariness. As darkness settled over the farm, Ghost and Duke made their way into the barn for the night. Ghost paused beside James, lowering his head in what had become their evening ritual. James reached up to stroke the horse's forehead, fingers gently tracing the whirl of white hair between his eyes. We made it 3 months, buddy, he said softly. What do you say to forever? Ghost blew softly through his nostrils, his breath warm against James's palm. It wasn't an answer exactly, but it felt like agreement nonetheless. The seasons turned. Summer heat gave way to autumn crispness, the paddock maples flaming red and gold before surrendering their leaves to November winds. James added heavy blankets to the horse's care routine as the temperatures dropped, and spent weekends winterizing the barn with additional insulation. Ghost's first winter in captivity brought new challenges. The sound of ice pellets against the barn roof sent him into momentary panic, until Duke's steady presence helped him recalibrate. The first snow confused him. He pawed at it suspiciously before venturing cautious steps into the strange white substance. By December, he was racing through the drifts alongside Duke, their breath visible in frosty clouds as they played. James documented these moments faithfully, his photo collection and journal expanding into a comprehensive record of Ghost's journey. Dr. Abernathy had encouraged the practice as therapeutic for James himself, a way of marking progress and acknowledging growth. The visual evidence of Ghost's transformation often provided perspective when James struggled to recognize his own changes. Christmas brought Emily and her boyfriend Mark for a 3-day visit. Mark, a soft-spoken high school science teacher, had heard stories about Ghost and Duke but seemed unprepared for the reality of their presence. "They're so aware," he remarked after watching James's morning routine with the horses. "The way they look at you, like they're really seeing you." James nodded, understanding exactly what Mark meant. After decades of military service where emotion was often suppressed, where vulnerability could be dangerous, the horses' straightforward presence had been revelatory. They responded to the truth of his emotional state, not the facade he presented. They required honesty, consistency, and authentic connection, qualities that had become the foundation of his recovery. As winter deepened, James found himself emerging from isolation in other ways. He volunteered at Willow Creek Equine Rescue one morning each week, sharing the knowledge he'd gained with Maggie and her team. Occasionally, he spoke with potential adopters, his quiet authority and genuine passion making him an effective advocate for the rescue horses. In February, Sarah connected him with another veteran in the area who was struggling with PTSD. Thomas Garcia, a former Army Ranger in his 30s, arrived one snowy afternoon, his skepticism evident in the rigid set of his shoulders and the careful neutrality of his responses. "Sarah thought it might help to see what you've done with Ghost," he explained, hands shoved deep in his pockets. "I'm not really a horse person." "Neither was I," James replied, leading him to the paddock where Ghost and Duke were enjoying the winter sunshine. Thomas's military training was evident in his observation skills. He missed nothing as James demonstrated Ghost's handling routine, noting the careful approach, the consistent cues, the mutual respect. "He was wild?" Thomas asked, watching Ghost lower his head for James to slip a halter over his ears. "As wild as they come," James confirmed, terrified of humans and with good reason. Someone had abused him badly before abandoning him. Thomas was silent for a long moment. "But he trusts you now. We built it slowly, day by day. There were setbacks, still are sometimes, but yes, he trusts me." How? The question contained multitudes, and James recognized it wasn't just about horse training techniques. Consistency, patience, being trustworthy. And James paused, considering how to express what he'd learned. Accepting that the scars don't disappear. They become part of who he is, but they don't define everything he can be. Thomas stayed for nearly 2 hours, gradually relaxing enough to accept James's offer to help groom Duke. As he left, he asked if he could return sometime, a request James readily granted. By spring, Ghost's rehabilitation had progressed beyond anyone's initial expectations. While still cautious with strangers, he now accepted handling from both James and Emily, would load into a trailer with minimal hesitation, and had mastered basic ground training exercises. His physical transformation was equally dramatic. His once dull coat now gleamed in the sunlight, muscles rippling beneath skin that no longer stretched tight over visible ribs. On a warm May day, exactly 1 year after Ghost's arrival, Emily organized a small celebration. She arrived with a carrot cake for the humans and special apple molasses treats for the horses, along with a framed collage of photographs documenting Ghost's journey from terrified rescue to confident member of their unusual family. "A year ago today," she said, raising a glass of lemonade and toast, "a very skinny horse and a rather lost Marine found each other. I'd say it worked out pretty well for both of them." James, unused to being the center of attention, accepted the toast with a gruff nod. But later, as they watched Ghost and Duke grazing peacefully in the evening light, he found the words to express what the year had meant. "I was just existing before," he told Emily quietly, "going through the motions. Ghost gave me something to care about beyond myself, something that needed me specifically, not just anyone who could fill a role." Emily squeezed his hand. "You needed each other." The next day, after Emily had returned to the city, James received an unexpected call. Thomas Garcia, the veteran he'd met in February, had been talking with other members of his support group about his experiences visiting the farm. "There's interest," Thomas explained hesitantly, "in what you're doing with Ghost. Some of the guys were wondering if you'd be open to some kind of program. Nothing formal, just opportunities to be around the horses, to learn from your experience." James's immediate instinct was to refuse. He wasn't a therapist or a professional trainer. Ghost and Duke weren't therapy horses. What could he possibly offer other veterans that trained professionals couldn't provide? But as he looked out at Ghost, who had arrived broken and terrified and was now thriving, he reconsidered. Perhaps there was value in simply sharing what he'd learned, in creating space for others to experience the healing potential of connection with these remarkable creatures. "I'm not qualified to run a program," he said finally, "but if people want to visit, spend time with the horses, learn what I've learned, that's something I could do." A week later, Thomas returned with 2 other veterans. James kept the visit simple, introducing the horses, explaining their backgrounds, demonstrating basic handling techniques. The men were respectful, asking thoughtful questions, and maintaining appropriate distance from Ghost, who observed them with cautious interest. Before they left, one of the men, a former Marine who'd served in Afghanistan, approached James privately. "I haven't slept through the night in 3 years," he admitted. "But watching you with that horse, it's the first time I've felt peaceful in I don't know how long." That night, as James completed the evening barn check, he paused to watch Ghost and Duke settling down for the night. Ghost, sensing his presence, raised his head and nickered softly, a sound of recognition and welcome that never failed to warm James's heart. "We did it, buddy," he said quietly. "1 whole year." Ghost approached the stall door, stretching his neck to touch his muzzle to James's outstretched hand. In that moment of connection, James felt the truth of what they had accomplished together, not just survival, but transformation, not just healing, but growth. The journey wasn't over. Ghost would always carry the effects of his early trauma, just as James would always carry the memories of war and loss. But they had found a way forward together, step by patient step, creating something new from the broken pieces of their past. And in that creation, they had both found their way back to life.